Okay, let's go. So welcome everyone. My name is Rachel, and I would just like to begin by acknowledging that tonight's event and the work of the organizers are happening on the stolen, traditional, and ancestral homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, or what is known as Vancouver in British Columbia. And for those of us here who are settlers on these lands, our presence is an ongoing act of colonization. When we acknowledge these territories, we also acknowledge our responsibility to center Indigenous sovereignty and histories, and not just today's conversation, but also in our learning, teaching, organizing, and being. And we believe that this is a critical part of engaging in the field of planning, and why tonight's topic on decolonizing planning education is of importance to us. And so tonight's event is organized and hosted by UBC Capacity. We are a newly formed student club at UBC that works to promote equitable, just, and inclusive city planning practices, and to provide resources, events, and opportunities related to urban planning for our undergraduate students. And as students, we recognize how the legacies of colonialism continue to this day in the form of segregation, displacement, and exclusion embedded in colonial planning practices, as well as the devaluation of Indigenous planning traditions. And in so-called Canada, we know that white supremacy is pervasive in the urban planning profession and persists in the field of planning education. And so this evening, we are very lucky to have with us Kamala Todd, Spencer Lindsay, Luna Aisin, Lara Terrian Bulos, and Alejandra Lopez Bravo to be in conversation around what it means for us to decolonize planning education. And we were intentional in choosing the word decolonizing. As Eve Tuck and Kay Win Young reminds us, decolonization is not a metaphor for simply improving our societies and schools, but that it specifically requires the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. And so we will have an hour of moderated Q&A session, a 5-minute break, followed by a 20-minute audience Q&A. And throughout this event, at any point of time, you can head over to Slido and type in 271220 to submit a question for the audience Q&A. And you can also upvote questions that you would like us to ask the panelists, and we will be picking the top 2 to 3 questions with the most votes. And I believe either Louisa or Rose will be popping that information in the chat right now. And so without further ado, I will pass my time on to Karen, who will kick off and will be moderating our Q&A this evening.
Hi, so first off, we'd like to give each of our panelists about 10 minutes to introduce themselves, some of their work, and to tell us what decolonizing planning education means to them. What are the structural changes required in academia to achieve that? And to start off, can we please have Kamala?
Nice one, thank you.
Spencer, actually. Right?
Spencer, please.
Fine, Kamala, you're getting called on.
You said you would go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Spencer Lindsay. I was born and raised on the traditional unceded territory of the Lekwungen-speaking Squamish Songhees First Nations, which is also known as Victoria, BC. My ancestors come from all over, from Scotland and England, in Germany to southern Alberta. Settled in the early 20th century there, and also from England, Scotland, and from the Métis peoples of Red River, who eventually settled in the Touchwood Hills and in central Saskatchewan. Feel like I can hear someone making coffee or something in the background. Mute your mics. So I was thinking of where to start just my intro, and I think I kind of got my start in planning at UBC, and it's really, it's cool to be talking with, folks, some who are just starting out at UBC and are getting interested in planning, because really, I took a Indigenous language revitalization course one summer that was amazing, and part of the assignment was the final assignment was to come up with a practical way of revitalizing a language. And so we were all kind of in that, like, how do we apply what we're learning? And I ran into someone her name is Sarah Lang, in the hallway after, in the next semester. And we were like, we should like do something. I don't know, we had this urge to like, take some action on what we've been learning in Indigenous studies. And we decided to go to the student leadership conference and address the fact that the first year residents, Totem Park, used names that no one ever gave permission to use. And a lot of the names were like incorrect, like Kwakiutl should refer to the Kwakwakwa people, and students at Totem Park residents would do things like dress up Indian and just had no context. It was just complete appropriation. And Sarah made a meeting with the head of housing, and she didn't consult me before doing this. I would have been too afraid, but she set a meeting with the head of planning or head of housing at UBC to talk about this. And basically we showed up in his office, and he was like, hey, we're building 2 new buildings. How about you help us name them? And so that was really my start in planning, is, following the relationships I built through, the UBC Longhouse, mentors from First Nation studies would come in and out to help us in the process, because a lot of people don't really want to listen to students when we say, hey, actually, Musqueam wants to use their orthography and their names, and they actually don't want to anglicize, and they actually, we had to build on use our relationships to make that happen. And yeah, that was kind of my introduction. And then I heard about this place called SCARP, and I ended up doing the Indigenous Community Planning Program. After that, I did some work at neighborhood houses, a little bit of work in like development planning, nonprofit housing development planning. I wasn't very good at that. I kind of landed in a great place when I was hired by the city of Vancouver as their first Indigenous engagement specialist. So I worked in the communications and engagement department on that. Worked on the Britannia Community Master Plan project, which I'd worked on an earlier iteration of that when I was an undergrad in First Nation Studies. Full circle, I started working with the city on that. I made a lot of friends and connections with elders through that community that are still really part of my life now and are mentoring me as I move into my role at Vancouver Coastal Health as a project manager. And I'm working on all sorts of things like standardizing as much as you can. You can't really standardize Indigenous engagement or Indigenous design, but what tools can we give to project managers who are building new buildings to make sure they loop in, the local nations at the right time and know what to ask and know how to talk to them to make sure that Indigenous design is incorporated into buildings. And we've been working on urban Indigenous pandemic response. In terms of decolonizing planning, and this kind of structural changes in academia, I think in terms of the structural changes that are needed is, and I see it in planners working, on the institutions I've been in, we need to honor lived experience. You can have a PhD and no relationships in community, and this sounds mean, like you're worthless to community planning and real, decolonized community planning. If you're not nurturing and building relationships, you haven't built trust in community. And there's a lot of people who do this kind of organizing work, but they never had the means or the family support, or had multiple barriers to getting your degree. So I think acknowledge, like, having people that are teaching from that lived experience, that's going to take significant changes, because we don't honor that right now. And yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say about decolonizing planning education is, I've heard that decolonizing is kind of an absence of something. We're taking something away, we're decolonizing. What's in that space there? I really believe that Indigenous communities and all communities somewhere deep down, we know how to take care of each other. It's these colonial systems of bureaucracies that often insulate us from actually being in reciprocal relationship with community, that stop it. We need to get out of the way, and we need to set less restrictions. Needs to collect people's SID numbers and to have a charitable number, and we need to get out of the way and really listen and recognize the work that's happening in community. Thanks.
Thank you, Spencer. Kamala?
Thank you. Tanse, everyone. My name is Kamala. I was born and raised and grew up all over the Metro Vancouver area, but it's not my land, even though it's my home and it's where my children were born and are growing up. My own ancestors are from Korean Métis homelands, and also on my dad's side, he's a first generation Canadian of German immigrants. And so growing up in these territories, I'm currently speaking to you from Gibsons and Squamish and Shishal territories. But I'm, very mindful of my gratitude for all the peoples whose lands I've moved around freely through over the years, primarily Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and much of my work has been focused on Vancouver as well. And so I describe my work and my life's work as really about learning and unlearning, and learning what it means to live on someone else's lands, to grapple with my own, the effects of displacement that have affected my family and my children. And, my grandfather did speak Cree, but he didn't teach it to his children. And therefore, my mom wasn't able to teach it to us, although she's been doing her own work over the years to try to help our family reconnect with the language and so on. But my primary focus is looking at my responsibilities on these lands and practicing my cultural teachings of reciprocity and what that looks like. And so much of it is beginning to see with really clear eyes the very deeply entrenched and normalized colonial system that I've grown up surrounded by, and then also that I've been part of, both in university and working for the city of Vancouver over 20 years off and on, and also now teaching at SFU in urban studies, and next semester in at SCARP at UBC. And so I consider myself a decolonizing educator when it comes to teaching, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But when I think about the planning profession, it goes hand in hand with my own ongoing critique and analysis of the world around me. I didn't actually go to planning school. I went to UBC in geography. My master's is sort of urban cultural geography, and really thinking about analyzing the built environment around me, analyzing how we live on the land in the city, and then through the generous sharing of people from the local nations, I've come to have a deeper understanding of my place here, and try my best to think deeply about, as Ronnie Dean Harris talks about it, what is your relationship to land, to water, and to stars? And as Spencer mentioned about language, what is the language of this place? And to think deeply about the fact that people have been living and dying and loving and caring for these lands for thousands of years. And where is that reflected? And how many of us who live on these lands know that and connect with that and are following the actual original laws and teachings and knowledge systems and governance systems that were always in place here. And so I see, the city of Vancouver itself as a colonial imposition onto Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands. I have come to, just get really blunt in my language around saying to planners, now that I'm not there, but even when I was there, as people were embarking on the citywide plan, saying, by whose authority do you have this decision-making power over somebody else's lands? By whose authority did the so-called great white fathers, the founding fathers, claim these lands work to depopulate and eradicate and clear these lands and assert and impose these imposed self-serving laws and systems. And so when we talk about reconciliation and we talk about decolonization, how many planners within that system are really at that stage of that deep self-reflection, that deep, humility around, what is the roots of this system? And are we just adding Indigenous voices and, having meetings with the local nations, or are we actually looking at the ongoing violence and harms of this system? Because the system was created expressly to take over someone else's land. The system was created expressly to, as I said, depopulate and clear the land. And so everything that we do is part of that system. No matter how much we change it from within, it is still part of that original objective. And so as much as I spend time kind of critiquing that, I'm also trying my best to learn how to understand and honor and live by the teachings and legal principles of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, over here on the Sunshine Coast, also the Sechelt people. And think about the kinship relationships. Think about, as Tsleil-Waututh talk about their sacred responsibilities, their sacred trusts and stewardship responsibilities towards their lands. And how can I contribute to the people, the first people, to continue to have those relationships? And how can I contribute to an undoing of this really harmful system? And so in my teaching, I refuse to uphold sort of traditional planning thinkers and writers and theory as sort of the expertise that we need to start from, or as like the center of knowledge. I deliberately only assign Indigenous thinkers and authors, and they're not always planners. They're very often poets and filmmakers and, from many different disciplines, unless it's about critiquing a city plan. And we do a lot of that as well. But that's a big part of my practice is, what constitutes knowledge. And I was so heartened by your introduction and that acknowledgement of territory and the acknowledgement that Indigenous people, we have planning traditions like any society that goes back thousands of years. And in the, colonial city building project for Vancouver, that was ignored. There's a very deeply entrenched and ongoing mythology, thanks to the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of reception, the terra nullius, all of those various mythologies that reinforce this idea that this was an empty land free for the taking, or at the very least, it wasn't very populated and the people weren't really using it very well and they didn't really know what they were doing and they were lawless societies. And so that total discounting of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous laws, Indigenous brilliance, and our rights to make decisions on our lands and to practice our life ways as we always have, that is also embedded into this idea of, who are the founders of this place? Who are the caretakers of this place? And so I worked diligently to try to address that and to expose that. And I'm not just there to teach, oh, let's look at some cool ideas. I'm fundamentally working towards transformation. I'm working to change hearts and minds. I'm working to change my own thoughts and approaches through teaching. I don't think that teaching should just be about, oh, let's just share some ideas. It has to be about, transformation and decolonization. And decolonization has to actually mean getting to the roots of this system and what it was about. Because if I hear one more person say how progressive Vancouver is and how this is the most livable city and we're so much about, amazing public engagement without contending with the truths of how the city was made and, the devastation that it caused, then we're just replicating that system. And so, yeah, I'm happy to talk about other examples of projects that I've worked on or things that I do in my class, but very, very grateful to be included in this conversation. So, hi, thank you.
Thank you, Kamala. You made a really good point about addressing how it's not just how Vancouver has progressed so much. Next, can we please have Alejandra?
Thank you. Thank you, Spencer and Kamala, and thank you for the organizers. Yo me llamo Alejandra López Bravo y estoy llamando desde el territorio nunca antes cedido de Musqueam, Squamish y Tsleil-Waututh. Y soy originalmente de la Ciudad de México, de las tierras otomís, matlatzincas y nahuas. Y llevo en Vancouver 14 años. Y para mí es importante reconocer las tierras indígenas porque tuve el privilegio de venir aquí y fue mi decisión, no fui desplazada. Y para mí es importante seguir desaprendiendo la historia colonial y también seguir reflexionando sobre mi responsabilidad y el rol que yo tengo en caminar en solidaridad con las tierras indígenas. And so, thank you, Rachel, for inviting me, and thank you for the organizers. Thank you for the panel speakers. My name is Alejandra López Bravo, and I've been practicing to introduce myself and acknowledging the lands that I'm on in my language as a practice of decolonization and solidarity. And so I just share that I'm calling from the unceded and traditional territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh on East Van, on Hastings Sunrise, where I live. I am originally from Mexico City, which is the land Otomi, Matlatzinca, and Nahua, the indigenous peoples, the original people of that territory, Mexico City. I moved to these lands in 2006, so 14 years ago already. And the land acknowledgement is very important to me because I am an uninvited guest, and it was my choice and a great privilege to move here. I came to study, so I wasn't displaced. I didn't come here as a refugee, which I think it does make the difference. And so I'm an uninvited guest. I'm an immigrant, but I'm also a settler because I benefit from being here and from this land. And I try to practice this land acknowledgement to always reflect on my role and the responsibility I have in unlearning the colonial history, and also in reflecting on what's my responsibility to walk in these lands in solidarity and to unlearn. And I also want to share that this is a very unique time to continue on my unlearning and my own learning, to be accountable to the communities I work alongside. I work with Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities and undocumented communities. My paid job is with a community foundation, Vancouver Foundation. It's a funding organization, and as most philanthropic organizations, is kind of also the mother of white supremacy and colonization, the same like academia. The philanthropic sector exists because of the extraction of the land and the accumulation of wealth at the expenses of Indigenous people and Black and racialized communities. So I just want to put out there, because the same I feel about academia as how it has been a tool of oppression and less so of liberation. And that's my paid work, but I specifically work in an initiative called Level. And that's where I had the incredible fortune to meet Rachel and Aslan, that I know he's here as well. And I work in an initiative called Level, trying to address racial inequity in the nonprofit sector by creating opportunities and investing in the leadership of Indigenous, Black, and racialized youth and their communities. And then in my non-paid work, I volunteer for Kiwasa Neighborhood House, which is the neighborhood where I live on Hastings Sunrise. And and neighborhood houses have a very, very special place in my heart because during my 14 years journey in Vancouver, I worked for 4 different neighborhood houses. So when I moved to Hastings Sunrise and they invited me to join to the board, I was very excited to be able to contribute in the neighborhood that I live. And I'm also part of a collective called Sanctuary Health. It's a collective of community members, migrants, healthcare workers, community organizers, where we advocate with and organize with migrant undocumented families. And we advocate for access to services for all, regardless of their immigration status, and the principles of Sanctuary City to create spaces of access for all and also without fear of deportation. And so I feel lucky that this work also grounds me since I've been working for Vancouver Foundation for 3 years, and it sometimes it just feels like such a disparity between the philanthropic sector and even smaller community organizations and the community at large. I also want to just share a disclaimer and a story. Like a few months ago, a friend of mine that I went to school with at SCARP, because I did my master's at the School of Community and Regional Planning many years ago. And so I do want to share that I left very happily thinking I'm never again gonna even talk about SCARP because SCARP is not my battle. And I'm still convinced that that the advocacy that is required to address white supremacy at SCARP, at UBC, or in academia is not my battle. But I feel thankful that there's other people and other young people that are, that we need them to be there to decolonize these spaces. A few months ago, a friend of mine that I went to school with after the riots in the United States, and also because of George Floyd, some SCARP students organized to write this letter. And I didn't even know because I'm so far removed from SCARP at this point. And some of my friends asked me if I could help them write a letter. And I just responded very candidly that this issue is not new. 12 years ago, and probably before me, because this work is not about me. It's been going on. There's been people resisting way before me, and it's going to continue after me. But 12 years ago, when I was still at SCARP, I produced a video that reflected how I personally experienced the lack of acknowledgement of my expertise, work experience, academic experience, and worldview. And it was raw and honest, and I felt very, very vulnerable. I remember this video, the director of SCARP decided to show it to the next year's cohort, because once I did it through SCARP, they were gonna use it there. And right now, I'm at a different moment in my life. I can articulate that what I experienced was racism, and I know that when I felt inadequate or when I felt I didn't belong, it wasn't me. It was the systemic racism upheld by students, by faculty, and by the university. And most of my learnings during my time at SCARP, I owe to my involvement and work outside of SCARP with migrant and Indigenous communities, particularly Indigenous and migrant women. I also feel lots of gratitude for the people in my life that now are my chosen family, mostly non-white folks that created a community of support and care that made my first 6 years in Canada less challenging. The lack of different perspectives in faculty, staff, and students at SCARP drove me crazy. And when I graduated, I'm like, I'm never gonna come back. Because right now I have the opportunity, and since then, to work towards creating alternative spaces of learning where people show up as their full selves, their knowledge is valued and respected. And this is where my commitment is. This is what I create now. I try to create now, and I know that, I need to continue my unlearning journey because that's not something that you arrive to. you continue to learn, and I'm committed to, to continue to learn about anti-Black racism and continue to work to reflect this in my work and how to work in solidarity with Indigenous people. But after I left SCARP, I promised, that's never going to be my battle. I continue to say I'm a reluctant planner. I don't consider the work I do as planning, and not because I don't think planning is everything, but because the way planning was taught to me, it erased who I am and the values I hold. And so, I worked for Break-In Community Center with Indigenous and migrant families, creating alternative spaces for learning. And I can give more examples. My first project with refugee youth was called the Illustrated Journey Youth Project, which I have actually used for my thesis at SCARP to create comics for young people to draw their journey of migration and their experiences once they were in Canada. My partner just brought me one of them. But anyways, I'm happy to share more about this because I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandra. I think it's really important to address some alternative spaces for decolonizing and understand that our education is a form of oppression. And moving on, we'd love for Lara.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Hello, bonsoir. My name is Lara Terrian-Bulos. I use she, her pronouns, and I am here with my partner, Luna, which is really exciting. We are on the traditional unceded stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples as well, which is where I grew up. My ancestry is Egyptian on my dad's side. He came to Canada at the age of 18. Largely leaving Egypt and that region because of the political and social destabilization of imperial actors that are familiar to these lands as well, British, French, and others. And so I don't have a lot of connection to that place. I've never been to Egypt, and it's part of my story. And then on my mother's side, I am 11th generation French Canadian settler. And the majority of my ancestors, as far as I have traced them so far, came from France, a little bit from Germany, and settled in one particular place in Quebec. So I hold these complex lineages within myself, and a big part of my planning practice is navigating that complexity and bringing that full complexity of self to my work. It's also very much, I think, in the learning that I've done around my ancestry that has informed so much how I show up to my work with Indigenous peoples in particular, which is where the majority of my planning work is these days. And I own my own company, which is quite exciting and unexpected. Also a huge privilege that comes from having been raised in a family that had some generational wealth, and also my father's journey in this country included a lot of assimilation for survival, which is not something that I fault him for, and also something that I feel as a second generation person on that side of my lineage, it comes with some reckoning. So I do a lot of work internally and also externally to redistribute some of that wealth and redistribute the knowledge that comes with the privileges that I hold. So my company is called Unearthing Wisdom, and I mostly do planning and facilitation and engagement work with Indigenous communities. Some of the work that I'm currently doing is quite focused on Indigenous health and healing. There's, I think, a lot of focus on that right now, and with Spencer at BCH, it's pretty exciting to be able to talk about the connections there. But some of the work that I've done has included currently working with Squamish Nation on a project that is reconnecting people to their lands and territories and traditional plants as an avenue and exploration for preventing and managing chronic illness. Also working with the First Nations Health Authority on some of the primary care work that's happening in that area, and that is really centering Indigenous ways of doing and healing in the provision of healthcare, which is really exciting. And I think revolutionary and really important work that I'm really honored to support, and other things as well. I'm really glad that the organizers mentioned the work by Tuck and Yang, because I was thinking about, decolonizing education and just recognizing that the word decolonizing is, I think, thrown around quite freely these days. And really at its root, it is about land back and power back to Indigenous peoples. And so as a planner who is not Indigenous to these lands, doing work on these lands, a lot of things that Kamala was talking about resonate in terms of that reckoning of who has decision-making power here, and why is that, and how can we be shifting structures and processes back in the ways that they need to be shifted. So it's something that we think about and talk about a lot. And I feel like as a settler who has mixed race identity and can kind of, already understand the complexity of living in a place that isn't necessarily fully your own, or that there's some disconnection there, some displacement. It's important for us to be able to situate ourselves in this work. And if we're not able to start with that and start from within, then I don't think that planning education or planners can really go much further. And I think there's a lot of resistance to that. I also went to SCARP, and I went to SCARP, 10 years after Alejandra, and a lot of it was, sounds very similar to the experience that Alejandra shared with us. And what I found as a student who was in the Indigenous community planning specialization is that I would go to, the mainstream master's courses where we would learn about, all of the things that planners in municipalities right now are just continuing to do. And then I would go into the Indigenous community planning courses and basically learn about why that's really not what you should do at all, and how harmful that's been. And I like to use the word kind of, like academic cognitive dissonance for that experience, because it was so interesting to me that that was my experience in learning. And it was also so frustrating that most of my peers were not coming to the Indigenous planning classes, right? Most of my peers were just in that mainstream master's, and that's still the case in the way that the program is set up. So, SCARP as a white planning institution is still perpetuating a lot of harm and continuing to create harm by not examining what it's teaching in any kind of meaningful, critical way. So when I think about decolonizing planning education, really, I think a big question is, well, how do we work and is it possible to work in a structure where, the way that people will get tenure is based on very specific research patterns and, the ritual of the dissertation and the defense. And then once you get a teaching job and then you're on a tenure track and you receive that, there's really not a lot of incentive for you to change the way that you do things. And then all of that is also happening within a structure of a university where, universities over time, in the way that we think about them in the Western world, have had different iterations. But currently in Canada, as public institutions, universities have been getting less and less public funding from government. And so they've become more and more like corporations. And we see that in the way that people are prioritized. We see that in the way that courses are taught. We see that in the way that universities make decisions about what they care about, whether they'll divest from, tar sands and extractive projects that are continuing to extract from people and exploit. And that's part of the structure, right? So I think it's amazing for us to be having this conversation, and we also need to be able to zoom out and look at some of those structures and actually say, well, what does it actually take to decolonize an entire university system? Because it's great to have a couple of instructors, doing their best to kind of balance things out or teach something that's a little bit different. But at the end of the day, it's still happening in that context, right? Where the way that decisions are made are steeped in colonialism and white supremacy, and more is better, is growth is more. And that's the way that universities are going, right? So I feel like I rambled a little bit, but I'm excited to continue to add to the conversation and excited to hand it over to Luna. Thank you.
you. Last but not least, Luna.
Hi, 大家好，我名叫鬼爱心，我名的意思是是月亮加真正爱心，那我在这边徛在温哥华，我种在 unceded Coast Salish territories of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. Hi everyone, my name is Luna Aisin. My name translates to moon, love, and heart. Yeah, so essentially every time you look at the moon, just think of me loving you, even though I don't know you. It is really, really interesting to be on a panel, especially on this panel, considering that I've never been to SCARP. I'm like Kamala. I do not go to school for planning. In fact, education is such an interesting topic for me. So I come from this place in Southeast Asia called Singapore. I was born there. I'm mixed race with ancestries tracing back to the Peranakan people, who are a hybrid of Chinese people, along with Nusantara people, who are people from the outer islands of Java. So yeah, my ancestors were voyagers, and they're also volcano people, which explains I'm always hot, always warm. Even in this cold city, even though I came from a tropical country, you know, I remember my first time being on these lands, and I step outside when it snowed in shorts and flops and just a t-shirt, and I managed to stay outside for half an hour. People thought I was crazy. My new neighbors thought I was crazy. Anyways, it is so interesting to talk about my background. So I'm a settler here. I've been here since 2001. The topic of decolonization is very, very important to me, simply because even though I've been here for almost 20 years, it took the very first 10 years of my life to really understand what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to lose home. I wouldn't say that I come as a refugee, but I did leave my country, birth country, because of a lot of very difficult experiences growing up there, tied to abuse and trauma. So to put it, to say that I've lost my home is a very deep feeling that, you know, the words I don't think can capture. So it's a lot of grief of losing home and losing place and losing connections to land and people and community, that I found myself here trying to figure out what my connection is to these lands for the first 10 years. And it wasn't until I turned 30 years old that I decided that I would be nice to myself and try this higher education thing for once, because when I was growing up in Singapore, I was really poor. I was so poor that, you know, people really didn't think much about me and my community. We were always sort of like the gangsters of the school, because we were like misbehaving and we would tell our teachers to stop torturing us. So we were the loud bunch. Fast forward, so in terms of education, I went to Capilano University because I really wanted to be nice to myself and learn art. I've always thought of myself as that artist that could have never made it. I couldn't be an artist in Singapore because it was too expensive. So I decided that, oh, maybe Canada will be nice to someone like me and allow me to pursue even just a very basic diploma in studio arts education, and that's what I did. So my access to education has always been very limited. I'm neurodiverse, I'm also queer, I have dyslexia, and it wasn't until the last couple of years that I realized that I had all these things. So hooray, a lot of fun new things to learn about who you are in the city that you have lived for such a long time. And in the last couple of years, it was just like, oh my goodness, this is who I am. This is how I'm treated in public. So funny enough, I don't think of myself as a planner. I think of myself as someone who's done a lot of work in community activations. I was very involved in the downtown east side, working with the Community Arts Council of Vancouver, because I really wanted to kind of understand and learn from people what the connection is to place. I love folklore. I love the stories that people tell. I also love relationships I'm a relationship nerd. And sometimes I describe myself as a relationship hedonist, which means that every time I see good relationships happen, I become very happy. And I think that's actually the basis for why I do planning. That is how I got into planning. And it really is because of the relationships that I have. And folks are kind enough to call me a planner, and I'm just Luna doing my thing. So people have been very kind to me in terms of that. And in terms of the decolonization part, why it is important to me, just to circle back to that part, is that I come from a colonized country. You know, Justin Trudeau's great-grandfather of 5 generations was the first resident of Singapore. We still have a Raffles Hotel, which you know, is named after the original colonizer from the East India Companies. So I have a lot of feelings about colonization because I feel like the place that I grew up in, I no longer have, like it's really hard for me to go home to those lands because I don't think that it welcomes me. I don't think that the education system had welcomed me. And even here on these lands, I still feel that as a settler, as an immigrant, my access to education is very limited. So the first time I heard about SCARP, because of my dyslexia, I'll admit, this is by no means disrespect. I actually thought it's a scrap. And you might not be the first one. So for the longest time, I thought the UBC program was called Scrap Program. I thought that's a very interesting name. But I never applied for it. I thought about it after I found out about it, but I never did, just because I couldn't afford it. I had been in really, really difficult relationships that have caused me to be homeless for a while. So I had to do a lot of healing in the last 10 years of my life. And also very specifically too, thinking about how trauma and my abilities and being queer, my negotiation with place, with planning, is a lot about reducing suffering. The work that I do, I currently work in a collective called the Hey Neighbor Collective that came out from the city of Vancouver. And it was a project to study social connectedness in high-rise buildings. And living in Singapore, I was born into a high-rise. So I know a lot about the connected communities within those settings. But somehow here in Vancouver, a lot of people reported being isolated. And I really think a lot of that is because of colonization. I get very involved talking about social isolation. And one of the things I started saying is social isolation came up from racism. It is because of racism that we feel socially isolated. It is because of classes and colonizing ideas that, you know, we experience social isolation, loneliness, disconnection from land. Yeah, I feel like in terms of being a planner, I would also call myself a planner that uses my body a lot as information. I don't know if you've ever, okay, I'm gonna tell you an interesting story. The first time I went to work at the city of Vancouver, the first time I walked into a city of Vancouver meeting, I realized that a lot of people that I was talking to, it's as though really like their bodies did not exist. And I could not understand it because I've been in my body for such a long time. And I know that my experiences in the city, the first thing that comes to my mind, the first thing that comes to me as data is how I feel when I'm in a place. I can walk into a place, feel it out for about a minute or so, and I'll leave. And I'll know whether it's welcome or not welcomed. And that is the kind of like day-to-day experience that I have to kind of navigate the city. So when I plan, I think about the people that I plan for, you know, not white people, unfortunately, sorry. I really plan for those that are like me because we understand each other, you know. Anyways, I feel like I also ramble a lot. That's it.
Thank you. That's a very interesting story about your body. We're going to go into our first question. This is, drawing examples from your own practice and experience, what are the potential and limits of planning as a spatial tool in redressing historical injustices? And feel free to jump in, whoever.
I think I do want to say, like, it's interesting. I had a former student contacted me yesterday, and they were asking about whether I think CCP, like any kind of community plan, is like fundamentally colonial, because a lot of First Nations are using them now. And I think the sad reality is we are in this world. This is the system now. And, you know, I've had people from the local nation say things like, it's really frustrating because, you know, you come to us and say, we're going to do this, and do you want to participate? And it has to be done in 2 months or whatever. And then people say, you know, that doesn't really work for us. We don't really want to participate in that way, or that may not be a priority for us, and we don't have staff or whatever, but we have to participate, because if we don't, you're going to do it anyway, and we won't have any kind of, you know, input or role in it. So given that we have this sort of deeply entrenched system, and we still have people who, for, you know, good or bad, are empowered to be making these decisions and to steamroll ahead, because the city is a machine, like speaking about Vancouver, just keeps on going. There are, I feel like, ways to make little radical inroads. You know, there's ways where in my experience in cultural services, bringing in, you know, cultural practitioners and just calling it like it is, and saying, no, you need to hear this, and you need to listen to this, and, you know, really just finding new language, and to just go into those spaces and to just say it. And I feel like it's getting a little bit easier in some ways, whether that, you know, people listen or make the changes or not. And as exhausting as it is, you know, when I was there for the last 2 years, I would just go into those rooms and just say it, and just start calling people out on their assumptions, and really, really hope that people start to become humble. And I don't know, I kind of feel like there's little radical acts like that throughout that can make some of those changes.
I just want to say, when I see the question and think about limits of planning as a spatial tool, I just want to point out that, like, I don't see planning as a spatial tool. I think some of the, this way the Western mind, you know, categorizes and separates things out into different disciplines. The idea that, like, I'm this discipline, I'm just going to focus on the space, you can deal with that, you know, relationship stuff, you know, like, to categorize that stuff out and think like you're going to exist in you know, in a vacuum, and just focus, like, I'm just going to focus on, I use this example. I know people don't do public engagement about sidewalks, but for some reason, this is the example. I'm like, say, like, and I would get this as an Indigenous person working in the city with not enough Indigenous people, and everyone afraid to do it wrong. So they always had to, like, call me or Kamala or whoever to do it for them, or to handhold them through. You know, I'd be called in and be like, okay, I'm working on the sidewalk. This needs to be the perfect sidewalk. And in order, and they didn't say this straight up, but basically the idea is we need community engagement. So I could tell my boss I did community engagement. And so we're going to, like, and then sometimes they would ask, you know, me, like, you know, draw on your relationships to come bring some people in here. And it's like, no, but also the limits of this divided up, siloed, you know, different departments and different, you know, disciplines, is that this person, if you invite, say, an elder in, they're going to tell you a story about a whole bunch of different things. And you need to really listen to that. And then you need to hear them tell you it a bunch more times. And then maybe a few years later, or maybe 20 years later, you'll be like, oh, that's what they meant, right? But we're so, like, this transactional way of engaging to do good planning is just, we just need to completely get rid of that. Because, say, if someone, you know, if they're getting engaged about the sidewalk and they say, well, you know, the way that I get to this store is like this, and, like, I, you know, and, like, it's hard for me to get off the bus here, like, they don't want to hear any of that, because they don't have power over it, because they only have power over that one thing. So I kind of see someone who's like, oh, I'm really interested in just like public space and like design and like, and I'm not as, you know, I'm interested in the art and I'm interested in, you know, the rationality of it. I mean, it wasn't until I was out of SCARP that I realized, oh, there are a lot of planners who go through, don't feel like they have a knack for really connecting with folks the way people like Luna do. And they hide behind these policies that are completely created by white men you know, a very long time ago, when white men were the only ones, white landowning ones were the only ones allowed to. And yeah, it just makes me, I wanted to say this at one point today, it drives me bananas knowing that there are some Scarpies who have left and are now just receding back into protection from having to have these tough conversations, from having to really look at their own privilege. And it takes comfort. It's easier to get a paycheck and to live comfortably and go la 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 because that's really the way that this white supremacy system is set up to work. And it's so sad that, you know, like, I don't know what a school can do. It seems everyone who's awesome that comes out of SCARP was also involved in a lot of different things, and had those. So yeah, there are lots of limits to just that spatial idea only.
I might just add in there, I love talking to folks because you just say some really cool things that I can build on. You know, when I saw this question, it interestingly for me wasn't about what the potential limits were. To me, it was more about who are the potentials and who are the limits. And I say that knowing that our bureaucratic systems really places very limited people with enormous power to do work such as social equity, to do work such as reconciliation, to do kinds of works that actually require so much more deeper cultural experiences and relationships and protocols, and sometimes completely different systems of being. I think that one of the first things about decolonization that I thought about for myself was there's got to be more than one kind of system to live in. This capitalist system, this white supremacy system is not the only one. We have been shown here by so many of our First Nations folks that living in other ways and the ways that they have been living has been so much better. And yet we're seeing in the last 150, 200 years of industries coming in to take over everything. And that's not just about what the potential limits of planning are, because we can talk every day about innovation. We can talk every day about inspiration. We can talk every day about redevelopments and whatnot. But when you have one person or one small group of people who are actually very limited in their experiences of creating a diverse place where people can live together with the relationships that we all subscribe to and can practice on and can reflect on, and also justice systems that bring people in, not to separate people out. So I kind of always think of like, you know, it's no longer about what tools anymore. It's no longer what programs we're coming out with. It's not even about the latest index. For me, it's really coming down to like, who ultimately is seeing what, how many people in planning who are like junior planners are doing all this work so that that one person can make that decision. And how many of us as planners also have been in situations where we fear, you know, the powers that might be in our hierarchy that threatens our job, right? Like a good example is that Spencer and I work on a social equity framework project at the city of Vancouver. And that was not a very pleasant experience because it was run entirely on bureaucracy. There was a lot of insincerity in how social equity as an idea, as an approach, not as a lens, but you know, it's like if we wanted to inject ourselves with social equity, then we got to have the systems to support that. And unfortunately, a lot of systems don't because they've been built out of original systems that were to catch slaves, That was to displace Indigenous peoples. That was to control the the immigrants that were coming into the city. So anyways, that brings up a lot of thought about not what car we're driving or what buses we're taking, but who is driving the bus. We're all on a bus right now, where we're here. And yet we cannot tell the driver we need to get off because the driver is way ahead of us.
Yeah, that prescribed route.
Yeah.
I think that the main thing that this question is really bringing up for me is kind of thinking about scale of impact and scale of action. And I am someone who really believes in just working at every scale. Our cat is being really cute next to us. And so, and Adrienne Marie Brown, who's an amazing Black writer and talks a lot about, breaking away from some of these systems that we've been talking about, talks about scale and fractals and how you can see things at a small scale and you can see them replicated at different scales. And so when I look at this question and I look at, the potential or the possibilities that planning brings in terms of redressing historical injustices, I mean, a little bit building off of what I shared in my introduction, it has to start with me. Like if I can't go into those meetings that, are challenging where, there might be one or two or no Indigenous people in the room and a bunch of people are making decisions, if I'm not willing to ask those uncomfortable questions as a settler, then I can't talk about, being in solidarity with people in a meaningful way. It has to be embodied in a regular way. And that's not to say that, I won't miss some of those things sometimes and I might not step up every time, but having that awareness as a planner and then being able to step up and step into those roles, and not in a savior way either, right? Finding those kinds of ways of navigating all of these ways of showing up and not doing it for cookies or not doing it because it's the right thing to be seen doing, but actually because it's the right way to be in relationship with this land, in the relationship with the tenders of this land, in relationship with the people that I care about, whose lands we're on, and I have privilege to be in relationship with many of those people, right? And that's what drives me. That's what the accountability is for. So I think a lot of times, a lot of planners have these really big ideas that they want to go and make these sweeping big changes, and they're working at this big scale, and they forget about the small scale. They forget about what's happening in the day-to-day offices. They forget about how interactions can also be a form of violence or a form of silencing. And so we need to be able to hold all of that. And that's not something that's currently being taught, I think, in a meaningful way at planning schools, to my knowledge, and I think was starting to in some courses, like in some of those Indigenous planning courses that I was in at SCARP, but it's not a broadly practiced practice. So I think that's part of it.
I think everything that's been said is so fantastic. And I think, like Luna, I just want to build on some of the things that were shared about the potential. And I'm like you, don't even want to call it planning, but I am fascinated by the concept of space. And I think the potential of picking on some of the things that have been said is the potential of creating space for others. And I think in this way, I think using also Adrienne Marie Brown, like moving at a speed of trust and having trust-based relationships. And I think that for me, that's the biggest potential and what I aspire for, if anything, as someone that hosts and holds space, to create space for others and with others and co-create and constantly ask who's missing, and being in the space of facilitation and planning to constantly looking at whose voices are missing, who's missing in this conversation, building trust in relationships and trusting processes, not necessarily outcomes, not making decisions that are transactional, but that are trust-based, that are based in connection to each other and in the understanding that we have something to learn from one another. And I think for me, those are the limitations that I saw when I was studying SCARP as well, because as Lara said, that's not something that is taught. I think mostly is dismissed, and what's rewarded is the transaction, the efficiency. I think a lot of my experience with studying planning in North America is that the school of planning, it's about efficiency and transaction and movement in public spaces, not about holding space to create these relationships to one another and trust each other. And yeah, I just think that the potential is creating spaces where if I agree that decolonizing is thrown around, but if we really want to share power, then we create spaces where, we're able to show up as our full selves. And I think that's the potential that I see. Like, we can catalyze those spaces, we can hold those spaces, we can bring people that are not at the table. We can create spaces that don't exist. I mean, through my work, one of the most exciting things for me is create spaces because of my own identity and the communities that I belong to, which is the migrant community, creating spaces for migrant and Indigenous communities to come together and learn from each other and learn about the alignment and also the unique experiences and the overlapping struggle. For me, that's so powerful that I didn't experience those spaces anywhere else when I started in Vancouver. And I think the potential of redressing historical injustice is centering these voices and centering justice and equity in creating spaces.
Thank you, Alejandra. I think that's a really good point about, and also going back to Luna's bus metaphor, we have to think about who's driving the bus, but also who are the passengers that we're picking up and who we're meant to be creating and holding space for. So after, for right now, we'd like to have a 5-minute break, and then this will be the end of our moderated questions, and then we'll come back into audience Q&A at about 6:45. Thank you, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'd just like to start going into the audience Q&A now. And the first question that we will be asking from you is it truly possible for us to decolonize planning education within universities as colonial institutions? Spencer, would you like to jump in?
Oh yeah, I accidentally unmuted, so now I'm going first. Yeah, but only if we're really willing to go there. It's not it's gonna look really, really different. And it means that people who are, like I said before, like, take comfort in knowing that there are rules. There's this level of bureaucracy, that is insulating them from community who actually wants results and wants like reciprocity. Like, it means like having it means, like talking things out in, to actually come to agreement on things. It means yeah, it means letting go of things that like efficiency. I'm thinking recently about how I seek to get like endorphins from like completing tasks. And I think that's like a huge like kind of way that I am colonized, or the way that we want to see results. We want to show our bosses that we've done results. We don't want to ever admit that we've made a mistake, or else we might lose our job. We have to get rid of that in order for it to happen. So I'm one that always says, like, we can tear this whole thing down and we will get there. But it depends how you say the question. If, you know, can an institution totally decolonize when, say, the city of Vancouver, where it's still the council has final say? Absolutely not. You know, can we have it with the, you know, the chancellor and the governance system that we currently have at UBC with all best intentions? Can we decolonize? Absolutely not. It takes real change in the way power functions.
Yeah, I would agree in terms of, like I said before, the various acts that we can do, and the things that we can refuse, and the things that we can push. And so that also has to do, of course, with, like Spencer said, we all have our own internalized stuff. We all have our own story, and also how far we're willing to go. But, you know, SFU right now has a whole process for indigenizing and decolonizing the curriculum, and they're working actively at that. And so in my own practice, you know, especially when I started teaching right when the pandemic hit, and then it was all online, and I was basically like, my priority is people's wellness. And that's not a normal approach of the academia or even work. It's like, you know, your performance and you're producing and you have to do this and you have to do that. And I deliberately resist all of that stuff. And I do it in how I am with my kids too. Like, I've learned along the way from a lot of like the unschooling things that a lot of parents are doing now too, and rejecting the whole colonial nonsense about attendance and, you know, performing these mindless, ridiculous, useless worksheets and all that kind of stuff. And I was told after my first course, the summer course, that my marks were a little bit too high. And I was like, well, you know, it was a pandemic. Most of the people were working day jobs. To me, showing up for a class and being able to think and be able to put together ideas is brilliant. And who am I to, you know, I reject all ideas about, you know, a subject. I don't do like learning outcome. I totally, they probably can't stand me because I don't do things the way you're supposed to. I don't do learning outcomes. I don't do a rubric. How can you create a formula? Well, if you do it this way, then you'll get this mark. I reject that completely. And then, like I said, I bring in only Indigenous voices. A lot of what I read is like Chief Dan George and local poets, and we watch videos, and then we bring in guest speakers. Like, there are ways to do it. And it's like, sometimes I feel like maybe because there's so much recognition of the need to decolonize and be more supportive of Indigenous people, sometimes we can push even further than maybe some people can, because there is this understanding that there is a need for it. So I just keep pushing, and I hope that that can help make some systems change, but at least within my little circle there, I'm doing things my own way. Things that I even told my students, like, stop using, you know, colonial references, or, you know, people would be talking about sustainability and they'd go to like the Audubon Society or like the Vancouver Heritage Society for Heritage, and they'd be like, no. And then they realize in themselves how trained they were to always go to those sources. So there's ways that we can make that change, but I agree, the whole system is fundamentally colonial, and that's, you know, that's a whole other thing.
Thank you, Kamala. Just for timekeeping purposes, we're going to move on to the next question. And this is, on a personal level, what actions can we take to actively decolonize our work and practice within the field of planning and beyond? Anyone? Alejandra, Laura, Luna? Feel free to pop in.
Thank you. I was still like reflecting on the question before. So if anyone wants to jump in before me, I think at a personal level, as I said, just unlearning everything I learned in SCARP, but also kind of trusting that who I am, my identity, my worldview, my knowledge and expertise bring a lot to the table. I feel like that's something that I need to unlearn. When I went to SCARP, the feeling of being inadequate, and trusting that, I mean, I wasn't even that young, and I have worked for a long time, and being be even questioning, like, you know, other people defining what being Mexican meant, instead of just, you know, because I know this happens to a lot of us, like women of color, that it's like other people defining how you should be perceived and see yourself. And I think for me, at a personal level, it's just trusting that who I am, and with all my intersections that I can't just pick apart, it brings a lot to the table. And then in terms of I was just trying to be, you know, assertive. I would like specific examples for planning school from my experience. And although that's not my battle, I already said, but I do think that there's lots of things to do that go beyond just representation. I think representation is important, but I think, like Kamala said, just doing things differently, like the things that she just gave examples about. You know, I was discouraged to do research on Zapatista women because I was in Canada. Like, oh, I think you should focus in something in Vancouver because you're in Vancouver, you chose to come to Vancouver. So why are you doing research about Indigenous people in Mexico if you're here? And so, you know, there's very little shifts that you can do, like the way we present and write research. Like for me, I wanted to, you know, do a comic book. And they were like, but this very specific format about doing research. And then also, how do I present it? I wanted it to be in community, not at UBC. It's so, for me, it's so simple. There's so many simple changes, like because my work was about in collaboration with community. And why would we present at UBC if this is with and for community? So, you know, let's bring the learning to where community is at. So anyways, those are just very specific examples.
Yeah, I think building on what's already being shared, I would add that it's important to know who we are, where we come from, and how we've landed here. And to actually dive deep in that and then look to those cultures and those places for the examples of how planning might have been done. So, you know, I'm doing some research now into Egyptian ways of doing things that didn't come to me through my family, but that can absolutely inform the way that I choose to do work. I also think of doing work in cycles, and reorienting my relationship to time has been a huge element in my decolonizing journey. So, you know, instead of looking at a planning process as a beginning, a middle, and an end, it's a cycle. You know, the seasons build on each other. We come back to things year after year. So when we do planning work, and even just the way that we're looking at time can be shifted, that starts to decolonize the way that we're doing our work as well. So I think about time, I think about place and identity and how that relates to where we are. Yeah, I'm loving what Kamala added in the chat as well around where we are and what the wisdom of this place has, and also accessing that in a non-extractive way then means being in relationship, you know, singing to the plants outside, having a relationship with the trees nearby and actually noticing how they're doing and whether climate change is impacting them. Like, that's planning too. So those are some things I wanted to add.
I will add on too. Oh, Kamala, you're speaking my language. And I just want to start right there. Personally, I think there are three things that I'm always actively reflecting on. One is relationships. And when I think about relationships, I really think about what have been the perils when I did not question how can relationships can be better, and how much suffering there was when we constantly find ourselves in relationships where powers are abusive. You know, I always think about this. If the systems on Tinder app, I don't have Tinder. Out of systems. I do not want to date. They don't welcome me. They don't like me. Why? Like that makes no sense, right? So that's one. Two, I would say food. Food is such an important act of decolonization. all of us come from food cultures in one way or another. And I think that when we do not really reflect on the food access, food security, cultural foods, the stories that come with it, the disconnection, the connection. Food is such an important way to have conversations and relationships, but to also actively think about what decolonizing means in terms of our food choices and understanding. And the final one is, I'm going to come back around, is language. I speak a lot about language because I speak 5 different Chinese languages, partly because I grew up in Singapore and have a lot of access to some of the languages available in the city. But it wasn't until the most, I would say like the last 5 years or so, that I started really thinking about the English words that are so hard to understand, that are often so ambiguous. I started translating them back into Chinese and really study sort of the visual characteristics and how the Chinese words and characters are formed. And oftentimes, like for example, I was just having such a headache with the word happiness. I hate the English word happiness because it's so ambiguous. But when I translated it into Mandarin or Chinese, it to me spoke as open-hearted. To be happy is to be open-hearted. And that's why I gave myself the name Aishin, because Aishin means open-hearted or love heart. And our languages contains a lot of systemic stuff. We don't know this if we do not pay attention to it or even put attention to it, is that our language can be very transactional and capitalistic and devoid of humanness. And so I'm really working on changing the language. So simple things like, for example, if I were to say it has been nice spending time with you, I would actually change that now to, it has been so nice to share time with you. Because I cannot own time. Time is not something I can buy and sell. I don't pay for it. I don't spend it, but I share it. You know, it's like I borrow and I share it. Just, I think the land is the same thing. We're all learning how to share the land. And right now we have systems that are not actually sharing the land well. So language, food, relationships.
Thank you, Bina. And this will conclude our, for my portion of the audience Q&A today. And I would just like to thank all our panelists for sharing your time with us. And I will hand it off to Rachel now. Thank you.
Yeah, just in the spirit of Lara, you were mentioning time as a colonial construct. I kind of don't want this conversation to end. Yeah, I think just in a time when we've been so apart from people, this event and this conversation has just really felt like a big warm embrace. And I'm pretty sure other folks in the room are feeling the same way. And so in closing, I just want to take this opportunity to express my gratitude on behalf of UBC capacity and everyone present today to all 5 of you for generously sharing your time and knowledge with us this evening. And even though we didn't have time to go through all the questions, I'm very sure that this conversation is not going to end today. It will not end today. And I encourage folks to continue asking the tough questions in spaces that you're in. And just some follow-up logistics, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with an event survey as well as a link to the recording if you'd like to share it. And we will greatly appreciate it if you could take 5 minutes just to complete the survey to better inform our future programming. And we also have a Facebook page, an Instagram page, and a mailing list. And I think one of my colleagues is going to pop those links in the chat in a bit. But feel free to follow us there to keep updated with some upcoming events and involvement opportunities. And yeah, with that, I just want to say thank you everyone for being here. Have a lovely weekend, and we look forward to seeing all of you at the next event. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Gracias, Rachel. Thank you, everyone.
Actually, can the speakers just stay for a bit? Sorry.
Yeah.
Like a good night, but not you guys.
Sure thing.
Oh,
Thanks,
yeah.
everyone. Merci.